Hi, guys. We are going to continue reading from the Forgotten Books of Eden. We are in the letters of Aristeas, and we're going to wrap it up today. It's chapters 9 through 11. Here we go. Okay, chapter 9. Verse 8 epitomizes the value of knowledge. Verse 28, parental affection. Note especially the question in verse 26 and the answer. Also note the question in verse 47 and the answer. This is sage advice for businessmen. Okay. On the following day, the same arrangements were for the banquet, and the king, as soon as the opportunity occurred, began to put questions to the men who sat next to those who had already responded. And he said to the first, "Is wisdom capable of being taught?" And he said, "The soul is so constituted that it is able by the divine power to receive all the good and reject the contrary." The king expressed approval and asked the next man, "What is it that is most beneficial to health?" And he said, "Temperance, and it is not possible to acquire this unless God created a disposition towards it." The king spoke kindly to the man and said to another, "How can a man worthily pay the debt of gratitude to his parents?" And he said, "By never causing them pain, and this is not possible unless God disposed the mind to the pursuit of the noblest ends." The king expressed agreement and asked the next how he could become an eager listener. And he said, "By remembering that all knowledge is useful because it enables you, by the help of God, in a time of emergency, to select some of the things which you have learned and apply them to the crisis which confronts you. And so the efforts of men are fulfilled by the assistance of God." The king praised him and asked the next how he could avoid doing anything contrary to the law. And he said, "If you recognize that it is God who has put the thoughts into the hearts of the lawgivers that the lives of men might be preserved, you will follow them." The king acknowledged the man's answer and said to another, "What is the advantage of kingship?" And he replied, "If we consider that we ourselves are afflicted by the misfortunes which fall upon our relatives, and if their sufferings become our own, then the strength of kinship is apparent at once. For it is only when such feeling is shown that we shall win honor and esteem in their eyes. For help, when it is linked with kindliness, is of itself a bond which is altogether indissoluble. And in the day of their prosperity, we must not crave their possessions, but we must pray God to bestow all manner of good." And having accorded to him the same praise as to the rest, the king asked another how he could attain freedom from fear. And he said, "When the mind is conscious, it has wrought no evil, and when God directs it to all noble counsels." The king expressed his approval and asked another how he could always maintain a right judgment. And he replied, "If he constantly set before his eyes the misfortunes which befall men, and recognize that it is God who takes away prosperity from some and brings others to great honor and glory." The king gave a kindly reception to the man and asked the next to answer the question how he could avoid a life of ease and pleasure. And he replied, "If he continually remembered that he was the ruler of a great empire and the lord of vast multitudes, and that his mind ought not to be occupied with other things, but he ought always to be considering how he could best promote their welfare, he must pray too to God that no duty might be neglected." Having bestowed praise upon him, the king asked the 10th how he could recognize those who were dealing treacherously with him. And he replied to the question if he observed whether the bearing of those about him was natural, and whether they maintained the proper rule of precedence at receptions and councils and in their general intercourse, never going beyond the bounds of propriety in congratulations or in other matters of deportment. But God will incline your mind, O king, to all that is noble. When the king had expressed loud approval and praised them all individually amid the plaudits of all who were present, they turned to the enjoyment of the feast. And on the next day, when the opportunity offered, the king asked the next man, "What is the grossest form of neglect?" And he replied, "If a man does not care for his children and devote every effort to their education. For we always pray to God not so much for ourselves as for our children, that every blessing may be theirs. Our desire that our children may possess self-control is only realized by the power of God. The king said that he had spoken well and then asked another how he could be patriotic. By keeping before your mind, he replied, the thought that is good to live and die in one's own country. Residence abroad brings contempt upon the poor and shame upon the rich, as though they had been banished for a crime. If you bestow benefits upon all, as you continually do, God will give you favor with all, and you will be accounted patriotic. After listening to this man, the king asked the next in order how he could live amicably with his wife. And he answered by recognizing that womankind are by nature headstrong and energetic in the pursuit of their own desires and subject to sudden changes of opinion through fallacious reasoning, and their nature is essentially weak. It is necessary to deal wisely with them and not to provoke strife for the successful conduct of life. The steersman must know the goal toward which he ought to direct his course. It is only by calling upon the help of God that men can steer a true course of life at all times. The king expressed his agreement and asked the next how he could be free from error. And he replied, if you always act with deliberation and never give credence to slanders, but prove for yourself the things that are said to you, and decide by your own judgment the requests which are made to you, and carry out everything in the light of your judgment, you will be free from error, O king. But the knowledge and practice of these things is the work of divine power. Delighted with these words, the king asked another how he could be free from wrath. And he said in reply to the question, if he recognized that he had power over all, even to inflict death upon them, if he gave way to wrath, and that it would be useful and pitiful if he, just because he was Lord, deprived many of life. What need was there for wrath when all men were in subjection and no one was hostile to him? It is necessary to recognize that God rules the whole world in the spirit of kindness and without wrath at all. And you, said he, O king, must of necessity copy his example. The king said that he had answered well, and then inquired of the next man, what is good counsel? To act well at all times and with due reflection, he explained, comparing with what is advantageous to our own policy with the injurious effects that would result from the adoption of the opposite view, in order that by weighing every point we may be well advised and our purpose may be accomplished. And most important of all, by the power of God, every plan of yours will find fulfillment because you practice piety. The king said that this man had answered well and asked another, what is philosophy? And he explained, to deliberate well in reference to any question that emerges, and never to be carried away by impulses, but to ponder over the injuries that result from the passions, and to act rightly as the circumstances demand, practicing moderation. But we must pray to God to instill into our mind a regard for these things. The king signified his constant and his consent and asked another how he could meet with recognition when traveling abroad. By being fair to all men, he replied, and by appearing to be inferior rather than superior to those amongst whom he was traveling. For it is a recognized principle that God, by his very nature, accepts the humble, and the human race loves those who are willing to be in subjection to them. Having expressed his approval at this reply, the king asked another how he could build in such a way that his structures would endure after him. And he replied to the question, if his creations were on a great and noble scale, so that the beholders would spare them for their beauty, and if he never dismissed any of those who wrought such works, and never compelled others to minister to his needs without wages. For observing how God provides for the human race, granting them health and mental capacity and all other gifts, he himself should follow his example by rendering to men a recompense for their arduous toil. For it is the deeds that are wrought in righteousness that abide continually. The king said, do not do that, Bax. The king said that this man too had answered well, and asked the 10th, what is the fruit of wisdom? Baxter, stop doing that. What is the 10th of wisdom? Bax, leave it alone. Leave it alone. Go play with one of your toys. You have many. what is the fruit of wisdom? And he replied them that a man should be conscious in himself that he was wrought no evil, and that he should live his life in the truth, since it is from these, Almighty King, that the greatest joy and steadfastness of soul and strong faith in God accrue to you if you rule your realm in piety. And when they heard the answer, they all shouted with loud acclaim, and afterwards the king, in the fullness of his joy, began to drink their health. And on the next day, the banquet followed the same course as on previous occasions. What is with you? Leave it alone. Previous occasions, and when the opportunity presented itself, the king proceeded to put questions to the remaining guests, and he said to the first, how can a man keep himself from pride? And he replied, if he maintains equality and remembers on all occasions that he is a man ruling over men, and God brings the proud to naught and don't chew on the book, exalts the meek and humble. The king spoke kindly to him and asked the next, whom ought a man to select as his counselors? And he replied, those who have been tested in many affairs and maintain unmingled goodwill towards him and partake of. I'm going to kill you. Stop playing with that. Knock it off. And God manifests himself to those who are worthy, that these ends may be attained. The king praised him and asked another, what is the most necessary? Stop, Max. Go play with something. Go play with something. Go. What is the most necessary possession for a king? The friendship and love of his subjects, he replied, for it is through this that the bond of goodwill is rendered indissoluble, and it is God who ensures that this may come to pass in accordance with your wish. And the king praised him and inquired of another, what is goal of speech? And he replied, to convince your opponent by showing him his mistakes in a well-ordered army of arguments. In this way, you will win your hearer, not by opposing him, but by bestowing praise upon him with a view to persuading him. And it is by the power of God that persuasion is accomplished. The king said that he had given a good answer, and asked another how he could live amicably with the many different races who formed the population of his kingdom. By acting the proper part towards each, he replied, and taking righteousness as your guide, as you are now doing, with the help of the insight which God bestows upon you. The king was delighted by his reply and asked another, under what circumstances ought a man to suffer grief? In the misfortunes that befall our friends, he replied, when we see that they are protracted and irremediable. Reason does not allow us to grieve for those who are dead and set free from evil, but all men do grieve over them, because they think only of themselves and their own advantage. It is by the power of God alone that we can escape all evil. The king said that he had given a fitting answer, and asked another how his reputation lost. And he replied, when pride and unbounded self-confidence hold sway, dishonor and loss of reputation are engendered. For God is Lord of all reputation and bestows it where he will. The king gave his confirmation to the answer and asked the next man, to whom ought men to entrust themselves? To those, he replied, who serve you from goodwill and not from fear or self-interest, thinking only of their own gain. For the one is a sign of love, the other the mark of ill will and time serving. For the man who is always watching for his own gain is a traitor at heart, but you possess the affection of all your subjects by the help of the good counsel which God bestows upon you. The king said that he had answered wisely, and asked another, what is it that keeps a kingdom safe? And he replied to the question, care and forethought, that no evil may be wrought by those who are placed in a position of authority over the people. And this you always do by the help of God, who inspires you with grave judgment. The king spoke words of encouragement to him and asked another, what is it that maintains gratitude and honor? And he replied, virtue, for it is the creator of good deeds, and by its evil is destroyed, even as you exhibit nobility of character towards all by the gift which God bestows upon you. The king graciously acknowledged the answer and asked the 11th, since there were two more than 70, how he could in time of war maintain tranquility of soul. And he replied, by remembering that he had done no evil to any of his subjects, and that all would fight for him in return for the benefits which they had received, knowing that even if they lose their lives, you will care for those dependent on them. For you never fail to make reparation to any. Such is the kindheartedness with which God has inspired you. The king loudly applauded them all and spoke very kindly to them, and they then drank a long draught to the health of each, giving himself up to enjoyment and lavishing the most generous and joyous friendship upon his guests. Chapter 10. The questions and answers continue, showing how the army officers sought to be selected, what man is worthy of admiration, and other problems of daily life as true today as 2,000 years ago. Verses 15 to 17 are notable for recommending the theater. Verses 21 to 22 describe the wisdom of electing a president or having a king. On the seventh day, much more extensive preparations were made, and many others were present from the different cities, among them a large number of ambassadors. When an opportunity occurred, the king asked the first of those who had not yet been questioned how he could avoid being deceived by fallacious reasoning. And he replied, by noticing carefully the speaker, the things spoken, and the subject under discussion, and by putting the same questions again after an interval in different forms, but to possess an alert mind and to be able to form a sound judgment in every case is one of the good gifts of God, and you possess it, O king. The king loudly applauded the answer and asked another, why is it that the majority of men never become virtuous? Because, he replied, all men are by nature intemperate and inclined to pleasure. Hence, injustice springs up and a flood of avarice. The habit of virtue is a hindrance to those who are devoted to a life of pleasure, because it enjoins upon them the preference of temperance and righteousness, for it is God who is the master of these things. The king said that he had answered well, and asked what ought kings to obey. And he said, the laws, in order that by righteous enactments they may restore the lives of men, even as you by such conduct in obedience to the divine command have laid up in store for yourself a perpetual memorial. The king said that this man too had spoken well, and asked the next, whom ought we to appoint as governors? And he replied, all who hate wickedness and imitating your own conduct act righteously, and they may maintain a good reputation constantly. For this is what you do, O mighty king, he said, and it is God who has bestowed upon you the crown of righteousness. The king loudly acclaimed the answer, and then looking at the next man, said, whom ought we to appoint as officers over the forces? And he explained, those who excel in courage and righteousness, and those who are more anxious about the safety of their men than to gain a victory by risking their lives through rashness. For as God acts well towards all men, so too you, in imitation of him, are the benefactor of all your subjects. The king said that he had given a good answer, and asked another, what man is worthy of admiration? And he replied, the man who is furnished in with reputation and wealth and power, and possesses a soul equal to it all. You yourself show by your actions that you are most worthy of admiration through the help of God, who makes you care for these things. The king expressed his approval and said to another, to what affairs ought kings to devote most time? And he replied, to reading and the study of the records of official journeys, which are written in reference to the various kingdoms, with a view to the reformation and preservation of the subjects. And it is by such activity that you have attained to a glory which has never been approached by others, through the help of God who fulfills all your desires. Cain spoke enthusiastically to the man and asked another, how ought a man to occupy himself during his hours of relaxation and recreation? And he replied, to watch those plays which can be acted with propriety, and to set before one's eyes scenes taken from life and enacted with dignity and decency is profitable and appropriate. For there is some edification to be found even in these amusements. For often some desirable lesson is taught by the most insignificant affairs of life, but by practicing, back, stop. But by practicing the utmost propriety in all your actions, you have shown that you are a philosopher and you are honored by God on account of your virtue. The king pleased with the words which had stop it. Jack, stop. The king pleased with the words which had just been spoken, said to the ninth man, how ought a man to conduct himself at banquets? And he replied, you should summon to your side men of learning and those who are able to give you useful hints with regard to the affairs of your kingdom and the lives of your subjects, for you could not find any theme more suitable or more educative than this, since such men are dear to God because they have trained their minds to contemplate the noblest themes, as you indeed are doing yourself, since all your actions are directed by God. Delighted with the reply, the king inquired of the next man, what is the best for the people? That a private citizen should be made king over them, or a member of the royal family? And he replied, he who is best by nature, for kings who come of royal lineage are often harsh and severe towards their subjects, and still more is this the case with some of those who have risen from the ranks of private citizens, who are, after having experienced evil and borne their share of poverty, when they rule over multitudes, turn out to be more cruel than the godless tyrants. But as I have said, a good nature which has been properly trained is capable of ruling, and you are a great king, not so much because you excel in the glory of your rule and your wealth, but rather because you have surpassed all men in clemency and philanthropy, thanks to God who has endowed you with these qualities. The king spent some time in praising this man and then asked the last of all, what is the greatest achievement in ruling an empire? And he replied, that the subject should continually dwell in a state of peace, and that justice should be speedily administered in cases of dispute. These results are achieved through the influence of the ruler when he is a man who hates evil and loves the good and devotes his energies to saving the lives of men, just as you consider injustice the worst form of evil, and by your just administration have fashioned for yourself an undying reputation, since God bestows upon you a mind which is pure and untainted by any evil. And when he ceased, loud and joyful applause broke out from some considerable time. When it stopped, the king took a cup and gave a toast in honor of all his guests and the words which they had uttered. Then in conclusion, he said, I have derived the greatest benefit from your presence. I have profited much by the wise catching which you have given me in reference to the art of ruling. Then he ordered that 3 talents of silver should be presented to each of them, and appointed one of his slaves to deliver over the money. All at once shouted their approval, and the banquet became a scene of joy, while the king gave himself up in continuous round of festivity. All right, chapter 11, the final chapter in the letter of Aristeas. Okay. For a comment on ancient stenography, see verse 7. The translation is submitted for approval and accepted as read. And verse 23, a rising vote of approval is taken and unanimously carried. I have written at length and must crave your pardon, Philocrates. I was astonished beyond measure at the men and the way in which, on the spur of the moment, they gave answers which really needed a long time to devise. For though the questioner had given great thought to each particular question, those who replied one after the other had their answers to the question ready at once, and so they seemed to me and to all who were present, and especially to the philosophers, to be worthy of admiration. And I suppose that the thing will seem incredible to those who will read my narrative in the future, but it unseemly to misrepresent facts which are recorded in the public archives. And it would not be right for me to transgress in such a matter that as this. I tell this story just as it happened, consciously avoiding any error. Conscientiously avoiding any error. I was so impressed by the force of their utterances that I made an effort to consult those whose business it was to make a record of all that happened at the royal audiences and banquets. For it is the custom, as you know, from the moment the king begins to transact business until the time when he retires to rest, for a record to be taken of all his sayings and doings, a most excellent and useful arrangement. For on the following day, the minutes of the doings and sayings of the previous day are read over before business comments, and if there has been any irregularity, the matter is at once set right. I obtained, therefore, as has been said, accurate information from the public records, and I have set forth the facts in proper order, since I know how eager you are to obtain useful information. 3 days later, Demetrius took the men, and passing along the seawall 7 stadia long to the island, crossed the bridge and made for the northern districts of Pharos. There he assembled them in a house which had been built upon the seashore, of great beauty and in a secluded situation, and invited them to carry out the work of translation, since everything they needed for the purpose was placed at their disposal. So they set to work comparing their several results and making them agree, and whatever they agreed upon was suitably copied out under the direction of Demetrius. And the session lasted until the 9th hour. After this, they were set free to minister to their physical needs. Everything they wanted was furnished for them on a lavish scale. In addition to this, Dorotheus made the same preparations for them daily as were made for the king himself, for thus he had been commanded by the king. In the early morning, they appeared daily at the court, and after saluting the king, went back to their own place. And as is the custom of all the Jews, they washed their hands in the sea and prayed to God, and then devoted themselves to reading and translating the particular passage upon which they were engaged. And I put the question to them why it was that they washed their hands before they prayed. And they explained that it was a token that they had done no evil, for every form of activity is wrought by means of the hands, since in their noble and holy way they regard everything as a symbol of righteousness and truth. As I have already said, they met together daily in the place, which was delightful for its quiet and its brightness, and applied themselves to their task. And it is so chanced that the work of translation was completed in 72 days, just as if this had been arranged of set purpose. When the work was completed, Demetrius collected together the Jewish population in the place where the translation had been made, and read it over to all in the presence of the translators, who met with a great reception also from the people, because of the great benefits which had conferred them upon them. They bestowed warm praise upon Demetrius too, and urged him to have the whole law transcribed and present a copy to their leaders. After the books had been read, the priests and elders of the translators and the Jewish community and the leaders of the people stood up and said that since so excellent and sacred and accurate a translation had been made, it was only right that it should remain as it was, and no alteration should be made in it. Alteration either by adding anything or changing in any way whatever any of the words which had been written, or making any omission. This was a very wise precaution to ensure that the book might be preserved for all the future time unchanged. When the matter was reported to the king, he rejoiced greatly, for he felt that the design which he had formed had been safely carried out. The whole book was read over to him, and he was greatly astonished at the spirit of the lawgiver. And he said to Demetrius, "How is it that none of the historians or the poets have ever thought it worth their while to allude to such a wonderful achievement?" He replied, "Because the law is sacred and of divine origin, and some of those who formed the intention of dealing with it have been smitten by God, and therefore desisted from their purpose." And he said that he had heard from Theopompus that he had been driven out of his mind for more than 30 days, because he intended to insert in his history some of the incidents from the earlier and somewhat unreliable translations of the law. When he had recovered a little, he besought God to make it clear to him why the misfortune had befallen him. And it was revealed to him in a dream that from idle curiosity he was wishing to communicate sacred truths to common men, and that if he desisted, he would recover his health. I have heard, too, from the lips of Theodectes, one of the tragic poets, that when he was about to adapt some of the incidents recorded in the book for one of his plays, he was affected with cataract in both his eyes. And when he perceived the reason why the misfortune had befallen him, he prayed to God for many days and was afterwards restored. And after the king, as I have already said, had received the explanation of Demetrius on this point, he did homage and ordered that great care should be taken of the books, and that they should be sacredly guarded. And he urged the translators to visit him frequently after their return to Judea, for it was only right, he said, that he should now send them home. But when they came back, he would treat them as friends, as was right, and they would receive rich presents from him. He ordered preparations to be made for them to return home, and he treated them more munificently. He presented each one of them with 3 robes of the finest sort, 2 talents of gold, a sideboard weighing 1 talent, all the furniture for 3 couches. And with the escort, he sent Eleazar 10 couches with silver legs and all the necessary equipment, a sideboard worth 30 talents, 10 robes, purple, and a magnificent crown, and 100 pieces of the finest woven linen, also bowls and dishes, and 2 golden beakers to be dedicated to God. He urged him also in a letter that if any of the men preferred to come back to him, not to hinder them, for he counted it a great privilege to enjoy the society of such learned men, and he would rather lavish his wealth upon them than upon vanities. And now, Philocrates, you have the complete story in accordance with my promise. I think that you find greater pleasure in these matters than in the writings of the mythologists, for you are devoted to the study of those things which can benefit the soul, and spend much time upon it. I shall attempt to narrate whatever other events are worth recording, that by perusing them you may secure the highest reward for your zeal. All right, guys, that is it for the letter of Aristeas. Thanks for watching and listening. Bye.